Okay, guys, we are going to discuss the CAMEL ratings today. But before doing that, let us analyze the assets and liabilities, income and expenses of a bank. Right. So we are going to look at the balance sheet of the bank first. We are going to look at the assets of the bank first. Now, the first item on the asset side of the balance sheet is cash, and cash consists of coins and currency notes lying as reserves with the bank and its branches. The second item is cash in the form of balances with central bank, essentially the CRR deposits and deposits with other banks. The third item on the balance sheet are investment made by the bank in government securities, stocks, bonds. The fourth item on the balance sheet of the bank are the loans and advances that the banks give. Now, this forms the majority of the bank's assets, and this is the most profitable source of bank assets. Banks earn interest on these loans and advances. Next item on the balance sheet of the bank is all the land and building, all the properties that the bank owns, which houses its head office and its branches. All the vehicles, computers, furniture, and other tangible assets of the bank, right? So these are the assets of the bank. These are what you are, this is what is you're going to see, what you're going to see on the asset side of the balance sheet, right? So these are the likely items that you are going to see on the asset side of a bank's balance sheet. Then we move on to the liability side, which is common stock. Next is your additional paid in capital, which is the excess of issue price over par value of a stock. So in India, we sometimes call it as share premium. Okay. Then we have retained earnings, right, which is the amount of profits that the company has reinvested in its business and not distributed as dividends. And remember, this is cumulative, right? So this is since the inception of the bank. Then you have your other comprehensive income. Now we know that certain unrealized gains and losses are not passed through the income statement, they are passed through OCI. And OCI or other comprehensive income is a part of shareholders' equity, right, which is reported on the balance sheet. Now, what are the likely items which form a part of OCI? First is any unrealized gain or loss on available for sale securities. Any cumulative translation adjustment if the bank is using the current rate method to consolidate the financials of its subsidiary. Any remeasurement gains losses on defined benefit pension plan, and revaluation reserves, typically your unrealized gains when the bank values its PP&E, when the bank values its fixed assets. Then on the liability side, you might see preference shares, you might see any bonds that the bank has issued, and you might see any amounts that the bank has borrowed from other banks. And you are going to see deposits. Deposits are basically the deposits that the bank accepts from individuals like you and me, corporates, institutions, and deposits are going to be the majority of the bank's liabilities. Okay, now we've discussed the assets and liabilities of a bank. Now let's go discuss the income and expenses. That is, let us go and discuss the income statement, the profit and loss account of the bank. Okay, so the first source of income for the bank is interest income, and this is the primary source. This is the bread and butter of the bank. This is the this includes the interest that the banks earn on banks earn on any mortgage loan, the interest on term loan, interest on car loan, etc., etc., etc. So all the interest that the bank earns from the various kinds of loans that the bank gives. Then we have your trading income. Now this is the income earned by the bank from its trading activities, from its investments in stocks and bonds. Then you have your fee based income, right? So fee based income could include your loan processing fee, right? Then those annual fees of credit cards, then any transaction charges or any transaction fees when you withdraw money from an ATM, right? So all these could be your fee based income, right? And this fee based income is a very important part of any bank's profit and loss account, because see, this income is generated by the bank without lending any money, right? Okay, so these are the various sources through which a bank generates its income. Okay, now let's move on to the expenses. So the first expense that we are going to see is interest paid on deposits, right? So this forms the majority of the bank's expenses. Any salaries, bonuses paid to the employees would be the next kind of expense that we would see on the income statement of a bank. Then any advertising and marketing expenses, right? So these would include the costs associated with promoting the bank's products and services, such as any advertisement campaigns, any sponsorships, any events. Then rent, utilities. This is basically the rent that the bank pays for its branches. Utilities, basically electricity bill, your Wi-Fi expenses, maybe, right? Your water bill, all those would be a part of your utilities. Then we have regulatory and compliance expenses. Now, these would include costs associated with complying with the various regulations and laws, such as expenses related to audits, legal fees, right, etc., etc. And we are also going to see depreciation on the income statement. Now, this would be the wear and tear of the physical assets of the bank over time, right? So, wear and tear of building, furniture, equipment, etc., etc., etc. So, these are the assets, liabilities, income, and expenses of the bank, right? Now, we are going to discuss the CAMEL ratings. Okay, so what is the CAMELS framework? And let's understand how CAMELS works. Now, CAMELS is a widely used approach to analyze a bank, and it views the bank as a deposit taking and a loan making institution. Now, CAMEL has six components: capital adequacy, asset quality, management capability, earnings efficiency, liquidity position, and sensitivity to market risk. Now, an analyst who uses the CAMELS approach to examine a bank undertakes analysis, and he assigns a numerical rating of 1 through 5 to each of these six components. A rating of 1 is best, and a rating of 5 is worst, right? So a rating of 1 is the best rating. It shows the best practices in risk management, and it generates the least amount of concern among regulators. Now, in contrast, a rating of 5 is the worst rating, right? It shows the weakest performance, and risk management practices, and it would also generate the highest degree of regulatory concern. So if a bank has sufficient capital to absorb losses, then this capital adequacy component would be, maybe assigned a rating of 1, which is the best. And if the bank does not have sufficient capital, say if the bank's capital is very small in proportion of its risk weighted assets, then capital adequacy may be assigned a rating of 5, and that's the worst. Okay, so the analyst would rate each of these 6 components, and after having done that, he would construct a composite rating, which is some kind of a weighted average of these 6 components for the entire bank. Now, this rating would help the management and the regulators understand and regulate the possible risks that the bank may be facing. A few points to note here, guys. Now, please remember that these ratings are not released in the public domain. So, the camel ratings are only available for to the management and the regulators, right? So, regulators, right? So, it's not available for people like you and me. It's only available to the management of the bank and the regulators. And the other thing that we must keep in mind is that lower the rating, better it is. Right? So a lower rating indicates a more financially stable bank, a less at risk bank. Right? So a lower rating indicates a more financially stable bank. Okay, so this was my camel rating. Okay, now let's understand the first component of these camels rating. Now the first component is the capital adequacy. Now we had discussed that losses of a bank are written off from its equity capital. So while discussing capital adequacy, the analyst basically checks whether the bank's capital is sufficient to absorb any losses, whether it is sufficient to absorb any shocks. So for that we calculate the capital adequacy ratio. Now, how do we calculate the capital adequacy ratio? It's tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital plus by divided by the risk weighted assets. Okay. So before discussing what tier 1, what tier 2 and what risk weighted assets are, we are going to discuss what capital adequacy ratio is trying to tell us. Now, capital adequacy ratio helps us check whether banks have enough capital to absorb losses and protect the depositor's money. Okay, so we have the formula of capital adequacy ratio. Now we'll discuss what tier 1 capital is, what tier 2 is, and what risk weighted assets are. Okay, now guys, capital of a bank can be classified into many types. It can be classified into many layers. The first layer is CET1 capital or common equity tier 1 capital. Then next is additional tier 1 capital or AT1 capital. And last is tier 2 capital. Okay. Now we'll discuss each of these 3 layers, each of these 3 tiers in greater detail. Now first discussing the CET1 capital. This is the core capital of the bank and it includes common stock, additional paid-in capital, retained earnings, OCI, and we deduct intangible assets and deferred tax assets from it. Okay. So So essentially we are adding common stock, APIC, retained earnings and OCI, and deducting intangible and deferred tax assets. Now you might ask me, why are we subtracting? Why are we deducting intangible assets? The answer is that Basel norms believe that intangibles are very difficult to convert into cash at any point of time. And in reality too, they are actually very difficult to convert into cash. That is why they are deducted from the core capital of the bank. And why are we deducting the deferred tax assets? Okay, so see guys, deferred tax assets will only benefit the bank. It will only reduce the tax liability if temporary differences reverse in the future, right? And deferred tax assets are created if you pay more taxes today, and if you've paid more taxes today, you have to pay less taxes in the future, right? So that is why we are going to deduct deferred tax assets, right? Because they will benefit only if temporary differences reverse in the future. Okay, so this is your CET1 capital. Then we have the additional tier 1 capital. Now, additional tier 1 capital's definition is subordinate instruments with no specific maturity and with no contractual dividend and interest. So, quite a scary definition. Now, you would think, what on earth in this? What on earth is this? So, basically, guys, your COCO bonds are an example of your additional tier 1 capital. Now, what are COCO bonds? Now, COCO bonds are perpetual, they do not have any specific maturity, and they are a hybrid debt instrument, that is, they have features of both debt and equity, and it is issued by banks. And these COCO bonds are automatically converted into equity if a specific trigger event occurs. Now, what could be this trigger event? This trigger event could be, if the CET1 capital of the bank falls below the regulatory norms, if the total capital of the bank falls below the regulatory norms. So, if the CET1 or the total capital or tier 1 capital of the bank falls below the regulatory norms, then these bonds, these debt instruments would be converted into equity. And once they are converted into equity, they are going to provide a infusion of new equity capital into the bank when it is needed most. Now, why is it needed most? See, guys, when this trigger event occurs, when the CET1 or tier 1 or total capital falls below the regulatory norms, then the bank is in a sorry state of affairs. And it's when the bank is in sorry state of affairs, it's only then that these bonds are converted into equity. So they provide an, you know breath of fresh air, right? They provide a buffer of equity to absorb losses in times of distress. So these are essentially your COCO bonds, which can be automatically converted into equity if a specific trigger event occurs, and this trigger event could be if the CET1 or tier 1 or total capital falls below the regulatory requirements. Okay, so what is your tier 1 capital? It is CET1 plus AT1 capital. Now let's discuss what is tier 2 capital. Now it's subordinate debt with maturity of more than 5 years. So these would include redeemable preference shares with maturity of more than 5 years, subordinate debt with a maturity of more than 5 years. Okay, subordinate to whom? Subordinate to deposits. Right. So in the event of the liquidation of the company, these subordinate debt holders would be paid after the bank has repaid the depositors' money. Right. So they are subordinate to the deposits. Okay. Then we have total capital, which equals tier 1 plus tier 2. And remember, tier 1 is made of two components, CET1 and AT1. Okay. So now that we've discussed the various layers of capital that the bank has, now we will discuss the order in which losses would be absorbed by these three types of capital. Okay, so the first to absorb losses, if the borrower fails to repay the bank, then the first to absorb losses would be the CET1 capital. It would be the first to be written down. And if CET1 capital has been completely written off, next in line to absorb losses is additional Tier 1 capital. And once additional Tier 1 capital has been completely written off, next in line to absorb losses is your Tier 2 capital. And if all the above forms of capital have been exhausted, losses would be absorbed by depositors. However, guys, to protect depositors, most countries have deposit insurance scheme in place to protect depositors up to a certain amount. So, under the current deposit insurance scheme in India, depositors are insured up to a maximum of 5 lakhs per depositor. This means that if the bank fails, each depositor will receive up to 5 lakh as compensation for their deposits in that bank. In the United States, the limit is $250,000. So if the bank fails in US, each depositor will receive up to $250,000 as compensation for their deposits with the bank. Okay, so this is the order in which losses would be absorbed. First your CET1, then 81, then Tier 2. Okay, guys, now we were discussing these COCO bonds. So we were saying that, uh, you know, if the bank's CET1 or Tier 1 capital goes below the regulatory norms, then the COCO bonds would be automatically converted into equity to increase the equity capital of the bank. But this is not what happened in the most recent past. We all know what happened with Yes Bank, and Yes Bank had also issued COCOs. So when the when Yes Bank was facing difficulties, right? Uh, Ideally, these bonds should have been converted into equity, but Yes Bank just wrote them off rather than converting them into equity. They were just written off. A similar thing happened in the Credit Suisse case. Credit Suisse had 13 COCO bonds outstanding, some 6 million francs, or maybe more than that. I'm not sure. Right? These bonds were also not converted into equity, but they were completely written off. Now, European regulators have time and again said that equity should be the first to absorb losses before bondholders. So, the decision to write down these COCOs rather than converting them into equity raised a lot of anguish among COCO bondholders, right? So, you know, uh, although we are saying that first to absorb losses should be equity, but in the most recent past, these bonds were written off before equity was written off. Right? Okay, so this is our discussion for the day, guys. If you've liked this video, please comment, like, and subscribe my channel. Thank you, guys. Tata, see you. Bye bye. And wait for the next part of this particular video.